I remember vividly the moment, in fact, when I became a father for the first time. When I saw my son's scrunched up, red, wet, wrinkled, bawling face under the harsh delivery room lights, I felt an immediate and overwhelming sense of connection and continuity streaming through the generations. Powerful sense of lineage, if you will. I knew that I was stepping into a role and a reality that countless others had inhabited before me, but it was now my turn to be a father. I wasn't afraid or anxious or even particularly proud, just awestruck by the overwhelming reality of it all. I distinctly remember the words forming in my mind, "This is as real as it gets." I have no idea if my dad felt that way when his first child was born. I've been thinking a lot about my father lately, as well as about my relationship with my own children. Although my dad has been gone for 13 years now, I continue to learn from him and wonder about him. I've always liked that line from Robert Anderson's play, "I Never Sang for My Father." Death ends a life, but it does not end a relationship, which struggles on in the survivor's mind toward some final resolution, some clear meaning, which it perhaps never finds. I don't have any special wisdom about fatherhood to offer you in this sermon, just a few personal stories to share. Call them father stories, if you will. You already know my firm belief that people are made of stories, and a large part of the work of fathering, I think, is to create and to share and to invite and to curate the life-giving, life-sustaining, and transforming stories that will become the very stuff and substance of his children's developing souls. I loved reading stories with my kids when they were small, from the stiff cardboard pages of Goodnight Moon as I rocked them to sleep. We graduated to Curious George, Mike Mulligan and the Steam Shovel, and my personal favorite, Little Toot. Long before my firstborn son could read, he had completely memorized the story of Little Toot the tugboat, and he could recite it with perfect inflection and timing as I turned the pages, much to the delight of all the adults in the room. I didn't discover night driving until my sons were grown, so I didn't read it to them. But when I first read it, I thought that the author must have stowed away in the back seat of my father's car. So pitch perfect was his rendering of the mood and the atmosphere and the incidents. I never made that particular excursion to the Rocky Mountains with my dad, yet the description and the illustrations of listening to the ball game on the radio, watching for deer on the side of the road, white-tailed deer in our case, not mule deer, but changing a flat tire, stopping to eat and chat with the waitress at a roadside cafe, turning off the headlights just for effect on a deserted stretch of moonlit highway, etc. All of these brought me back to my childhood, sitting there in the passenger seat of my dad's Ford Fairlane. Coming back late at night from visiting relatives on Minnesota's Iron Range, my father would take the gravel road's shortcut home to Two Harbors. Sitting up front in the passenger seat, I imagined that it was my responsibility to keep him awake and alert. The truth is, I just loved being beside him in the darkness, illuminated only by the green glow of the dashboard instrument panel and the radio dial. There was something magical about tuning into a Twins game being played in some distant city, especially if we happened to be driving through a rainstorm at the time. I remember being secretly intoxicated by my dad's aftershave lotion and fascinated by the hair on his forearm as he gripped the steering wheel. Someday, I thought to myself, I'll be a man just like him. It's amazing when I think about it, how much intimate interaction with my father took place inside an automobile. There's a certain kind of intimacy that happens best, I think, when you're sitting side by side rather than face to face. At least that's been true for me. There was a time when I lived in Detroit while my children lived with their mother in southern Indiana. And I remember those long, long car rides before and after their visits when I would pick them up and return them to a designated halfway point somewhere in northern Indiana. Riding with my two boys, I learned everything I needed to know about, and then some, about the latest developments in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the X-Men, Dungeons and Dragons, magic cards, and all the other things that were important to them. There were times when we played the billboard game and maybe even tried to do a little of the homework that had been neglected during their visit. After what one of my divorced friends referred to cynically as the exchange of prisoners, I'd get back in my car for the 3-hour return trip to Detroit. And those were the saddest, loneliest, most painful and difficult hours of my life. The time that we had together during those years was so precious and limited. I missed so much the everydayness of their growing up. So I seized upon the moments that we were able to share, sometimes with a kind of death grip that I know made it hard for them. Nothing can make up for the lost time together, but I hold on to the hope, not with a death grip, but I hold lightly to that recognition that they are able to connect the dots between the memories, the stories that they do have, so that they live now within a story that affirms that they have always been loved by their father. The psychotherapist Robert Pellegrini coined the term critical incident narratives to refer to those small stories that help us to construct our sense of personal identity and to develop emotional maturity and achieve some degree of understanding of ourselves and others. Critical incident narratives, little episodes, episodic memories. And sometimes these critical incident narratives seem to blend together in a way that creates a single continuous narrative out of isolated episodes. So for example, it feels like I always used to go with my dad on his business trips, when the reality is it happened maybe twice. But the truth of the experience lies in the emotional resonance of the story. In stories, we capture the essence of relationships. Toward the end of his life, I had a chance to share a drive with my dad up the north shore of Lake Superior from Duluth to the Canadian border, a stretch of road that he knew well. And during this drive, which I sensed might be one of our last, I was the one at the wheel, and he in the passenger seat seemed especially willing to share memories and stories, and I was eager to listen. He had spent years as a traveling salesman, and it seemed that he knew virtually everyone who lived along Highway 61. Yeah, that's where Nell Zakovic used to live, he would say, pointing to a weather-beaten house clinging to the rocks near the icy waters of the lake. He was an old Norwegian fisherman, bright white teeth, silver hair, brown weathered skin. He took me out for a ride on the lake one day, and all of a sudden a heavy fog came in. I couldn't even see him sitting in the stern of the boat. It was so thick. He didn't seem too concerned, though, judging by his voice. He just kept talking about the herring and the whitefish and the smelt and how the lampreys were decimating the lake trout population. And after an hour or two of what seemed like aimless wandering, I'll be darned if we didn't just come right on up to his dock. The fog never lifted. He just knew his way home. Now, by this time, we were about a mile further up the road, and my father spotted another familiar homestead. Oh, yeah, he said, that's where Bob Axtell and his wife Doris lived. They were on a vacation up here back in, that must have been the late 50s, and they were from Topeka, Kansas. He owned a shoe store down there, but when they saw the lake, they dropped everything and moved up here, sold everything. They'd never seen so much water. Yeah, they used to have deer come down to the lake to drink right by their house there. Who were those people from Texas, I asked, vaguely remembering a couple I had met on one of those special occasions when I had accompanied my father. Oh, that was Bea and Ralph Griffith. They were from Wichita Falls originally. He moved up here and lived in a trailer by himself for a year, eventually got a job as a supervisor at the plant in Taconite Harbor. Later, they bought a resort on Seagull Lake. Now, he did get lost once up in the Boundary Waters. Yeah, he was missing for a couple of days, and his wife sent out a search party. And they found him all right, but he always insisted that he wasn't lost, the lake was lost. And so it went all the way up to the Canadian border, one story after another, stories that stitched together the lives and the landscape of the place where he had lived and I had grown up. Stories that gave meaning and depth and a sense of connection and belonging to that place and that community for me. The late, great Australian travel writer Bruce Chatwin coined the term songlines to describe the Aboriginal mythical landscape in Australia, layered with levels and levels of meaning due to the stories of encounters with the ancestors during what is called the dream time. Those songlines are the sacred scriptures of that oral culture, not written on paper, but inscribed into the landscape itself, telling there the story of the way the world came into being and continues to come into being. So it was like my dad was sharing the song lines that he knew of on that journey. And when we arrived at the border, I asked him to tell me the moose story again, even though I've heard it 100 times. It seems that one night he had come around the corner of a lonely gravel road near the border, and he met a big bull moose standing crosswise in the middle of the road, completely blocking it. And he came to the stop with the moose shining in the headlines. He was all by himself. He reached over and he pressed down the lock on the driver's side door. And then it occurred to him that the moose couldn't open the door. So he reached over very bravely and pulled the lock back up. And when he told that story, he'd laugh at his own foolishness, and we kids and our mom would mockingly celebrate his great courage. It was one of my favorite father stories. So the whole landscape along Highway 61, and indeed the landscape of the entire North Country, was enlivened and enriched and made meaningful for me by my father's stories. His songlines are now mine to keep and to cherish and to share. The very last car trip that I took with my father was the day after Christmas in 2009, when my older brother and I picked him up at the Veterans Home in Silver Bay and drove up the back way to the Iron Range to surprise our Uncle Jack on his 80th birthday. Several feet of snow had fallen the night before, and the woods were, as the poet says, lovely, dark, and deep as we started out on our journey. And just a few miles from Silver Bay, in the dwindling daylight, there beside the road, not one, but two big, beautiful moose stepped out of the woods as if to greet and salute my father on his way. This time, we didn't lock the door. In fact, we stopped the car, rolled down the windows, and snapped a few blurry pictures for posterity. But that moment, I don't need the photos, that moment remains clear in my memory as a little miracle. And that place on the road is now marked forever as having a part in my father's story, as being a pure grace note in the sacred song line traced by the journey of his life. I recently rewatched Tim Burton's movie, Big Fish. I don't know, has anyone seen that film? Okay. It stars Albert Finney, Ewan McGregor, and Billy Crudup. I enjoyed it even more the second time around. It's a story about stories, and it has just the right touch of Burton-esque magical fantasy to make the unbelievable believable. Crudup plays a character named Will Bloom, who is called home to the bedside of his dying father, Edward, played by Albert Finney, a man who is an inveterate storyteller and one who, let's just say, has a rather loose association with conventional notions of factual truth. Will has long since given up on the hope of finding in his father any firm, trustworthy, reliable, and solid role model. Dad, he says at one point, I have no idea who you are because you've never told me a single fact. I've told you 1,000 facts, Will. That's what I do. I tell stories. You tell lies, Dad. In the movie, Will's wife is pregnant with their first child, and his father uses that opportunity to impart his idea of paternal wisdom. Having a kid changes everything, says the elder Bloom. I mean, there's the diapers and the burping and the midnight feedings. Will responds, did you do any of that? No. But I hear it's terrible. Then you spend years trying to corrupt and mislead this child, fill its head with nonsense, and still it turns out perfectly fine. Will's father then begins to tell him, for the umpteenth time, a fantastical, outlandish story about the day Will was born. Supposedly, his father was out fishing that day in quest of a legendary, uncatchable catfish known locally as the beast. He succeeded in catching the beast, so he says, by using his wife's gold wedding band as bait. Will decides to listen to the story one more time. After all, the old man is dying. And as the tale unfolds, he finds himself hooked, drawn in despite himself. He still wants to know, despite it all, who his father truly is. And in the film, Ewan McGregor plays the young version of Edward, the father. And the story proceeds through a series of flashbacks, stories that Will has heard countless times before, but which he is now finally beginning to understand. And in this process, the boundaries between fact and fiction begin to blur, and the question of what is really real becomes more complicated as the healing and transformative power of story is revealed. The end of the movie is really quite touching and tender as the roles are reversed, and it is now Edward, the father, who on his deathbed asks desperately for a story, and Will, who is called upon to come up with a tale that weaves all the elements together and brings some sense and meaning to his father's life. Is it a true story? I can tell you this, it's a real story. It's as real as it gets. As real as a peach seed monkey. In a voice over to the movie's final scene, Will says, have you ever heard a joke so many times that you forget why it's funny? And then all of a sudden you hear it one more time and everything is new and you understand why you loved it in the first place. That was my father's final joke, I guess. A man tells his stories so many times that he becomes his stories. They live on after him, and in that way, he becomes immortal. I don't know about the immortal part, but I do know that in this world, all of us live through stories. And in the end, perhaps the most important thing that fathers have to offer their children is their stories. We all carry within us father stories. Some are happy, some are sad, some are tragic. Some ring with the resolution of completion and fulfillment. Others are incomplete and ambiguous or confusing. I'd like for us now to take a moment of silent reflection and for each of you to remember a father story of your own, one that you carry in your heart, whatever that might be. Just be in touch in this moment of silence. And then I want to ask you to think, if you were to give that story a title, what would the title be? Would it be Big Fish? The Peach Seed Monkey? The Moose in the Middle of the Road? Or something else? What would the title be of your favorite father story? And then if we have, and afterward we'll share, those who would like can share that title. Let's just take a moment now to remember.